In 2023, there was this legacy manufacturing company in India that, well, they practically turned off their own life support.
They really did.
Yeah, revenue plummeted to just 17 crore. And to anyone looking at the raw financial data, they looked completely dead in the water.
Right.
But then 3 years later, they're doing over 1,000 crore in revenue.
Yeah.
They're operating at 97% capacity, and they're generating profits at a pace that just defies standard industrial logic.
It's wild.
So today, we are opening the hood on Websol Energy System Ltd, or Websol Solar. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We've got a whole stack of source material today. We are looking at financials, strategic outlooks, some really complex unit economic breakdowns, and industry analyses.
Yeah, a lot of dense hardware numbers.
Exactly. And our mission today is to figure out how a company actually survives a brutal technology transition and rewires itself to ride India's enormous renewable energy wave.
Because it is a phenomenal turnaround to dissect. I mean, you are looking at a case study in extreme operating leverage and the harsh realities of competing in a policy-driven, hardware-centric industry.
Yeah.
And to understand how they pulled off this 17 crore to over 100,000 crore revenue leap, we really have to bypass the boardroom entirely. We have to start on the factory floor.
Right.
Because there is a very common misconception about what a company in the solar sector actually does.
I fall into that trap myself, honestly.
Hmm.
When you hear solar company, your immediate mental image is, a vast field of gleaming panels stretching out across Rajasthan.
Right, or like fleets of trucks pulling up to residential neighborhoods to bolt panels onto roofs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But Websol does absolutely none of that.
No, not at all.
They are not developers, they do not operate solar farms, and they definitely don't do the physical installations. They are strictly an upstream component manufacturer. It's a factory business, pure and simple.
Yeah, their output consists of photovoltaic or PV solar cells and solar modules. And it is really worth breaking down that distinction for you as you listen, because it is the fundamental dividing line in the entire industry.
Right, the cell versus the module.
Exactly. The cell is the core semiconductor unit. It's the piece of technology that actually performs the physics of converting sunlight into electricity.
Okay.
Whereas a module is the fully assembled panel. It's the protective glass, the aluminum frame, the complex wiring that houses a matrix of those individual cells.
So they can withstand a monsoon or a hailstorm.
Right. And Websol makes both. They make the raw cells and the finished modules.
Which means their customers are not homeowners looking to trim their monthly electricity bill. This is entirely B2B.
100% B2B.
They sell to solar project developers, EPC contractors, so the engineering, procurement, and construction firms building the infrastructure, and large commercial buyers. So if we look at India's renewable energy transition, Websol isn't building the green energy houses. They are running the high-tech kilns that bake the essential bricks.
That's a great way to put it. You cannot build the house without the bricks.
And their manufacturing footprint is scaling up aggressively to pump out more of those bricks.
Yeah. Based on the documentation we reviewed, their current stated manufacturing capacity sits at 600 megawatts of solar cells and 550 megawatts of modules.
Which is already significant.
It is, but they are actively scaling that up to 1.2 gigawatts of cell capacity, and their medium-term target is to hit 2.4 gigawatts in total manufacturing capacity.
I want to pause on those gigawatt numbers for a second because context is everything here. If Websol is building the essential components, we need to size the sandbox they're actually playing in.
Right, the macro picture.
Because the headline number that gets thrown around in almost every single industry analysis we looked at is India's target of 280 gigawatts of solar capacity by 2030.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It is an astronomical figure. It feels like a rising tide that should just lift every single boat in the harbor.
It is an enormous target, yeah. But if you apply some analytical rigor to that number, it completely changes the picture.
How so?
Well, the total addressable market, or TAM, for Websol is not that entire 280 gigawatt figure. If a domestic manufacturer plans their capacity based on the gross national target, they will literally bankrupt themselves.
Because they can't capture all of it.
Exactly. Websol's TAM is exclusively the market for cells and modules consumed domestically within India.
Right, because a gigawatt of new solar capacity in India doesn't automatically translate to a gigawatt of Websol's products being purchased.
Not at all.
They're competing against imports, much larger domestic incumbents, and constantly shifting technologies. So how do we actually calculate the realistic slice of the pie?
You really have to use a tighter framework. First, you take the annual installed capacity additions in India. Then you multiply that by the average module or cell wattage required per project. But here is the critical variable. You then have to multiply that result by the domestic sourcing share that is actually captured by Indian manufacturers.
Because historically, a really substantial portion of those components would just be imported from overseas suppliers.
Oh, absolutely. Suppliers who benefit from structural cost advantages, cheap capital, or just sheer raw scale.
Right.
Which is why the industry separates the served market from the open market.
Break that down for us.
Sure. So the served market represents the assets that are already installed, or the upcoming demand that is already locked up by existing long-term supply contracts, whether domestic or foreign.
So that's essentially off the table for Websol.
Yes. The open market, on the other hand, is the unbuilt capacity required to meet those 2030 targets, combined with the import substitution opportunity.
Got it.
It's the demand that opens up if domestic manufacturers can successfully displace foreign supply.
So even if the gross national requirement is in the hundreds of gigawatts over the decade, Websol's relevant, serviceable TAM actually narrows down to the tens of gigawatts per year.
Exactly.
But considering they're aiming for a 2.4 gigawatt capacity in the medium term, they still have plenty of headroom to grow without hitting the ceiling of their specific sandbox.
They do.
So the challenge isn't the size of the market. The challenge is that the sandbox is incredibly crowded.
It is. And securing their slice against well-capitalized competitors comes down entirely to their competitive edge.
Right.
If an EPC contractor is choosing between a Websol cell, an imported cell, or one from a larger domestic rival, what actually tips the scale?
Well, looking at their strategic positioning in the sources, it is definitely not a flashy brand.
No, definitely not.
The industry reports note their brand is present, but relatively weak as a standalone moat. People aren't buying Websol because of a slick logo.
Right.
Their actual edge, the thing that drove this crazy turnaround, is pure hard technology.
This is the absolute crux of how they survived. Websol made the incredibly difficult, highly capital-intensive decision to move away from legacy multicrystalline technology.
Which is the old industry standard.
Yeah. They completely scrapped the old way of doing things and transitioned to a fully automated Mono PERC cell line.
And the sources show the efficiency ratings, which is the percentage of sunlight hitting the cell that actually gets converted into usable electricity, improved from 18.9% to over 23%.
Right.
Now, I know that sounds like a tiny numerical bump to a layperson, but in the physics of solar, a jump from roughly 19% to 23% is a complete paradigm shift.
It's huge.
Why is that specific technology, Mono PERC, so incredibly difficult to implement?
Let's unpack the mechanics of what Mono PERC actually means, because it explains their moat. PERC stands for passivated emitter and rear cell.
Okay.
In a traditional legacy solar cell, a lot of the sunlight that hits the panel just passes straight through the silicon without generating any power.
Just goes right through.
Yeah, it's just wasted energy.
Wow.
PERC's technology solves this by adding a highly reflective passivation layer to the back of the cell.
Oh, interesting.
It essentially acts like a microscopic mirror. It bounces the unabsorbed light back up into the silicon for a second chance at being captured and converted into electricity.
So you are basically squeezing more juice out of the exact same amount of sunlight.
Exactly.
But putting a microscopic mirror on the back of a semiconductor sounds like something that works perfectly in a pristine laboratory, but becomes a total nightmare when you try to do it 10,000 times a day on a noisy factory floor.
That is the exact friction point. Applying that reflective layer at an industrial scale without introducing microscopic defects, which would completely ruin the cell's output, is incredibly demanding.
I can imagine.
It requires deep process know-how and totally flawless equipment integration. That proven operational capability is much harder for a competitor to replicate than just setting up a generic module assembly plant where you are just bolting together parts someone else made.
They also implemented larger wafer formats, right? Shifting to 182 millimeter and 210 millimeter sizes.
Yes, which also drives efficiency.
And the documents mention they are already moving toward bifacial cells, which capture sunlight from both the front and the rear.
Yeah, they're not standing still.
But alongside that deep tech advantage, the sources point out a secondary cost advantage tied to their geography. They operate in the Fulta Special Economic Zone, or SEZ.
Right, in West Bengal.
I'm looking at this and thinking, is an SEZ tax benefit really a structural moat? Or is it just a temporary buffer until competitors find similar regulatory loopholes?
You should view the SEZ location as a margin enhancer, not a durable moat.
Okay, that makes sense.
Operating in a special economic zone provides certain duty exemptions and tax benefits that improve their cost effectiveness on the global supply chain. But location advantages are easily replicable by well-capitalized competitors.
Right. Anyone with money can build in an SEZ.
Exactly. If another company builds a state-of-the-art facility in a different SEZ, that advantage neutralizes instantly. Their primary defense remains the technology, the production yield, and keeping their defect rate near zero.
Which brings us to the financial engine, because this technological upgrade from legacy multicrystalline to Mono PERC fundamentally altered their unit economics.
Completely transformed it.
We mentioned that 17 crore drop at the beginning of the deep dive. That wasn't an accident, was it?
No, it was totally deliberate.
They strategically shut down their legacy 250 megawatt line. They literally turned off their own revenue tap to stop producing an obsolete product.
It is the corporate equivalent of rebuilding your car engine while driving down the highway.
Seriously.
They absorbed a catastrophic short-term revenue hit just to clear the decks. But the engine they built during that downtime is a monster of operating leverage.
The recovery is staggering. They surged 20 times over to 575.5 crore and eventually hit 1,049 crore in FY26. That is an 82.4% year-over-year jump. Net profit for FY26 hit 303 crore, representing almost 96% year-over-year growth.
The numbers are incredible.
And the margins are what really jump off the page for me.
Yeah.
Post-upgrade, their EBITDA margins hit roughly 42%, with PAT margins sitting at almost 27%.
For a heavy hardware manufacturing business, extracting that much profit from every rupee of sales is almost absurd.
Right. It's software margins on heavy industrial hardware.
It all comes down to capacity utilization and the absorption of fixed costs.
Explain that.
Well, the sources show their capacity utilization is exceptionally high. They're running at greater than 90% at line 2 and an incredible 97% at line 1.
I want to make sure we really ground the concept of operating leverage here for you listening, because it is the entire key to their profitability.
It is the whole ballgame.
Think of Websol's factory like a commercial airplane flight. The fixed costs, the depreciation of those incredibly expensive new Mono PERC lines, the factory overheads, the salaries, they are immense.
Right.
That is the cost of fueling the plane, hiring the pilots, and paying the airport fees. The cost to fly that plane from Mumbai to Delhi is basically the exact same, whether the cabin is empty or completely full.
And if the factory is only running at 40% capacity, those immense fixed costs eat you alive. The flight loses money.
But once you sell enough tickets to cover the fuel and the crew, once you hit that break-even utilization read, every additional middle seat ticket sold flows almost entirely to profit.
Yes.
The variable cost of that extra passenger, or in this case the extra solar cell, is just a tiny fraction of the ticket price. Websol is operating at 97% utilization.
Yeah.
They are swaying with every single seat booked.
Exactly. Every incremental solar cell sold after that break-even point is pure profit, which is what is driving their incredible return on equity of over 56%.
It's just wild.
The fixed costs are fully absorbed, so the margins expand exponentially. But we also have to look at how this hyper-growth impacts their cash flow dynamics.
Right, specifically their working capital.
Yes, because growing at this speed puts a severe strain on a company's liquidity. The sources highlight a dramatic shift here. Prior to the upgrade, they had negative working capital days of minus 215 days.
Oh.
Post-upgrade, that shifted to positive 68.8 days.
Let's mechanically break down why that shift from negative to positive working capital days happens during rapid scaling. Because a positive 68.8 days means their cash is now tied up in the operational cycle for over 2 months.
Yeah, that's exactly what it means. So when you have negative working capital, your suppliers are essentially financing your operations.
Right.
You are collecting cash from your customers faster than you are paying your bills. But when you are growing your top line by over 80% in a single year, the entire dynamic flips.
Why does it flip?
Because you have to purchase enormous amounts of raw materials, polysilicon, silver paste, silicon wafers, and you have to hold significant inventory to fulfill a rapidly expanding future order book.
Oh, so you have to buy the supplies for tomorrow's huge orders using today's cash.
Exactly. That inventory buildup requires upfront liquidity. So even though they are highly profitable on paper, that cash is tied up in the warehouse for over 2 months before the final product is shipped, and the cash is actually collected.
So it's a structural constraint of rapid scaling.
It is. It's the classic growth trap.
They have completely optimized their current flight. The plane is full. The route is highly profitable. But to keep growing, to hit that next level of revenue, they need a bigger fleet.
Right.
Which brings us to their roadmap. How is management planning to execute this expansion without running out of cash or just, crashing the system?
The sources outline 3 distinct growth vectors: capacity expansion, deeper domestic penetration, and industry formalization.
Okay.
The most concrete and honestly the most capital-intensive part of this is the capacity expansion. They are not just tweaking the existing Falta factory, they are planning a huge structural and geographic leap.
You were referring to the Green Tea project in Andhra Pradesh.
Yes. The Green Tea project aims for a staggering 2-gigawatt expansion.
That is a huge jump.
It is. This is a geographic shift to scale manufacturing well beyond their current bases. But alongside that physical expansion, there is a very aggressive technology pipeline.
Because they aren't just stopping at Mono PERC.
No, they can't afford to. They are targeting commercial production of 600 to 750 megawatts of TOPCon modules by February 2027.
Okay, my read of the sources flagged a major operational risk here. The transition to TOPCon will require a single-line disruption and a 2-month ramp to full output.
Yeah.
Taking your primary production line offline for 2 full months in a booming market feels like corporate suicide.
Yeah.
My only guess is that if they don't take this hit now, their current panels will be completely unsellable in 3 years.
You're spot on.
Are they just choosing between short-term pain and long-term irrelevance?
You have assessed the risk perfectly. It is an immense operational vulnerability. You are taking your star player off the field right in the middle of the championship game just to upgrade their gear. For those 2 months, revenue from that specific line drops to 0. But your fixed costs, the factory rent, the salaries, they all remain.
And what if the upgrade hits a snag?
Well, if that ramp-up faces technical delays or if the new TOPCon yields aren't stable immediately, the financial hit will be really severe.
So explain the physics of TOPCon for us. Why is it worth risking a 2-month blackout just to upgrade from Mono PERC?
TOPCon stands for tunnel oxide passivated contact. It is basically the next evolution in efficiency.
Okay.
If PRC was about adding a mirror to the back of the cell to bounce light back, TOPCon is about fixing the electrical contacts themselves.
How so?
Well, in older cells, the metal contacts that draw the electricity out of the silicon actually cause a tiny bit of electrical loss, what physicists call recombination.
They leak power.
Yeah. TOPCon adds an ultra-thin layer of silicon oxide that allows the electrons to literally tunnel through while blocking those losses. It pushes the theoretical efficiency limit even higher. And to your earlier point, if Websol doesn't take the pain to adopt it now, competitors will flood the market with TOPCon modules, and Websol's current Mono PERC margins will just collapse. They are trying to stay ahead of the commoditization curve.
Right, and to protect themselves while they execute these high-wire technology upgrades, they are relying heavily on market protection mechanisms.
This is crucial to their near-term survival and their roadmap. Websols is operating heavily in the DCR segment.
That stands for Domestic Content Requirement.
Yes, and this entire structure exists under the ALMM framework, which is the approved list of models and manufacturers.
Let's detail how ALMM functions because it's fascinating. It operates essentially as a government-mandated VIP list, right?
That's a good way to look at it.
If a developer is building a solar project in India that utilizes certain government subsidies or power purchase agreements, they are legally required to buy their modules from companies that are physically located in India and certified on that ALM list.
Exactly. It creates a walled garden.
Why is that necessary?
Well, the geopolitical reality of solar manufacturing is that for the last decade, Chinese manufacturers built up such enormous scale and received such deep state subsidies that they could dump solar panels onto the global market at prices lower than the cost of raw materials.
That's insane.
It is. No domestic manufacturer anywhere in the world could compete with that on an open market.
Which means without ALMM, Websol would be totally crushed by ultra-cheap imports, regardless of how efficient their Mono PERC lines are.
Precisely. ALMM shields domestic manufacturers from that extreme volatility and ultra-low pricing of the global supply chain.
It's a buffer.
Yeah, it guarantees a captive domestic market with higher pricing power, which allows companies like Websol to secure the capital needed to upgrade to things like TOPCon.
Which is why the expert consensus in the sources separates Websol's future into a base case and an optional upside. The base case seems relatively straightforward. They just need to capture more volume within this protected Indian sandbox. As long as India keeps building solar and the ALMM framework holds strong, Websol's capacity expansion should translate reliably into revenue.
The base case is entirely dependent on domestic policy execution. The optional upside things like geographic expansion into export markets or moving adjacently into becoming EPC contractors themselves, that is highly execution dependent.
And unproven.
Very unproven. And honestly, based on the sources, it doesn't seem to be where their primary focus should be right now anyway.
And they probably shouldn't be focused there. The domestic demand is robust enough to absorb their 2.4 gigawatt target, provided they execute the expansions flawlessly.
Right, provided they do it flawlessly.
But that vulnerability we discussed, that 2-month single-line disruption for the TOPCon upgrade, that opens the door perfectly to what could go wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
The numbers we've discussed look phenomenal today. The margins are great, the return on equity is spectacular, but the solar industry is notoriously unforgiving. It's a landscape just littered with the skeletons of companies that expanded at the wrong time.
And the sources point out several shadows looming over Websol. The first, and perhaps most immediate, is margin compression.
Okay, let's get into that.
We are already seeing the early warning signs in the most recent data. Despite the incredible year-over-year revenue growth, their Q4 FY26 EBITDA margins narrowed.
By how much?
They dropped from around 45% the previous year down to roughly 36%.
Wait, really? A near 10-point drop in a single quarter is not a rounding error. That is a structural hit. If utilization is still at 97%, what is actually driving that margin compression?
Input costs are a major culprit here. Solar manufacturing is incredibly sensitive to raw material prices, particularly polysilicon and silver. Yeah, silver is critical here. It is used extensively in the conductive metallic pastes that are screen printed onto the front and back of the solar cells to carry the electrical current.
Because it's highly conductive.
Right. But it's also a volatile precious metal. So if the global commodity price of silver spikes, Websol's cost of goods sold shoots up immediately.
Normally, if a manufacturer's costs go up, they just pass that on to the customer by raising the price of the finished modules.
Right.
Why can't Websol just do that?
Because of the broader structural shadow over the entire industry cyclicality.
Right.
Solar is a textbook capital-heavy cyclical industry. We are currently in a boom phase in India. The policy support is strong, targets are aggressive, and demand outstrips high-quality domestic supply.
Which allows for high utilization and pricing power.
Exactly. But if that spike in silver coincides with new competitor capacity flooding the market, you lose your pricing power completely.
Because a boom phase always attracts overcapacity. Everyone looks at Websol printing a 56% return on equity and says, hey, we want a piece of that.
Yep. Competitors secure capital, they build huge new facilities and other SEZs, and suddenly the market goes from a shortage to a supply glut.
And when there is overcapacity, the only way to win a purchase order from a developer is to cut your prices.
Exactly. You cannot pass those rising silver costs on without losing the order. You are forced to swallow the cost increase and your margins compress.
Wow.
The fact that Websol's Q4 margins are already contracting suggests the competitive pricing environment might already be tightening.
And if we look back at our airplane analogy, Websol's current 97% utilization rate is doing all the heavy lifting of masking the industry's underlying cyclical risks.
It's hiding the danger.
If that utilization drops to 60 or 70% because of a sudden supply glut, those fixed costs suddenly become an anchor. The flight becomes unprofitable very, very quickly.
Layered on top of the cyclicality and the input costs is the regulatory risk. We spent time detailing how the ALMM framework and DCR segments act as a walled garden, protecting their margins from Chinese dumping. But what government policy creates, government policy can easily dismantle.
That's a great point. If the government decides that the only way to hit that 280 gigawatt target by 2030 is to relax import restrictions because domestic manufacturers just can't scale fast enough, that pricing power evaporates overnight.
It is a high-wire act reliant on a specific regulatory weather pattern holding steady. But there is one more shadow detailed in the sources, and it sits right on the balance sheet and ownership structure.
I'm glad we are pivoting to this because anyone examining the company structure really must keep these specific governance data points in mind when balancing the operational turnaround.
The figures are definitely stark.
Yeah, promoters, the founding or controlling group, hold roughly 29.7% of the company. Now, out of that specific holding, almost 89.4% is pledged.
Right.
And the stock itself trades at a price-to-earnings ratio of nearly 15 times and a price-to-book ratio of over 7 times.
Those figures present a very complex risk profile. Without diving into a whole finance lecture, a pledge means the promoters have used their shares as collateral for loans.
Okay.
A high pledge percentage on a relatively low promoter holding introduces a distinct layer of risk that is entirely separate from factory yields or silver prices.
Right, because if the stock price takes a hit, perhaps because of that margin compression we discussed, or a delay in the TOPCon rollout, the lenders could issue a margin call.
Exactly. Forcing the sale of those pledged shares and triggering further instability regardless of how well the Mono PERC lines are actually running. It demands profound caution from anyone analyzing the business. The operational brilliance we've discussed stands in stark contrast to those balance sheet realities.
It's a juxtaposition.
Yeah, you have a company executing a brilliant operational playbook valued with a high expectation of continued growth, as seen in those PE and PB multiples, but carrying a vulnerability at the ownership level that could really compound any operational missteps.
If the cycle turns against them, the margin for error is razor thin.
It is the definition of a high-stakes, high-reward industrial play.
So, bringing all these threads together, the brilliant technological pivot to Mono PERC, the high-stakes 2-gigawatt capacity expansion, the looming cyclical pressures of silver and silicon, and those stark governance figures, how do we synthesize this deep dive?
Well, Websol is an extraordinary turnaround story. It is a true case study of a company that took the painful, capital-intensive medicine required to modernize its factory floor.
They didn't just put a Band-Aid on it.
No, they abandoned outdated technology. They absorbed a brutal short-term revenue hit, literally dropping to 17 crore just to clear the decks and rebuild their engine mid-flight.
And they came out the other side, perfectly positioned for India's current domestic manufacturing push. The incredible revenue jump to over 1,000 crore and the high return on equity are just testaments to what happens when you pair the right high-efficiency technology with maximum operating leverage in a protected market.
But as we've seen, that success isn't static. The required transition to TOPCon, the physical expansion into Andhra Pradesh, the tightening margins, it all points to a company that knows it cannot afford to stand still.
Right.
The moment they stop innovating and expanding, the industrial cycle catches them.
It really circles back to that image of the factory. The machinery is humming, they are running at near full capacity, and they've completely transformed their unit economics. But the factory doors are still open to the harsh realities of global commodity spikes, shifting government targets, and the inevitable turn of the supply cycle.
And that leaves us with a final, lingering question to ponder.
Let's hear it.
Right now, Websol's incredible margins are heavily insulated by India's domestic content requirements. It is a highly profitable, politically constructed, walled garden.
Yes.
But what happens to domestic manufacturers if, 10 years from now, India decides its energy security is robust enough to fully open the floodgates to a global, borderless market?
That's the real question.
Will Websol's technology moat and operational excellence be deep enough to compete when the walls finally come down?
That is the ultimate test of their metamorphosis. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the forces driving the renewable transition, keep looking past the headlines, and keep seeking out those underlying mechanisms. We will see you on the next one.